If you want to go from gut feel to insight inspired, this is the Data Diaries with your hosts from Dexibit, Angie and Susan, and the best podcast for visitor attraction leaders passionate about data and AI. This episode is brought to you by Dexibit. We provide data analytics and AI software specifically for visitor attractions, so you can reduce total time to insight and total cost of ownership while democratizing data and improving your team's agility. Here comes the show.
How's it going, Susan? Everybody loves Monday?
That's good. It's good.
We always have a quiet day on Monday because it's still Sunday in the US. We get a moment to take a breath. Today we're having a chat about onboarding, do's and don'ts, and Susan's amazing hacks for coming into Dexibit as a new customer. I think it's one of those areas where people always have 1,000 questions before they get started. Susan, it would be great. Maybe we could start off with sort of getting into a bit of an introduction to Dexibit's onboarding philosophy, the anatomy of our 5-step process. Can you take us through some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a prescriptive methodology for onboarding at Dexibit, and that involves 3 workshops plus a user training session. And we work in 2-week sprints, so we'll have one workshop, give you 2 weeks, give yourselves some time to collate what you need for the next session, and then we'll have another workshop followed by the 3rd, and then finally user training before we shift into our monthly business reviews. And so our onboarding framework is really designed to help you configure and set up your basic support structure for the systems that you want to integrate. So it's really hyper-focused on connecting all of your core systems and getting everything ready for implementation.
It's sort of years of experiments and experience boiled down into a little bit of a method here that we prescribe.
Yeah, so we definitely want to make sure that everyone involved, it's going to be including your key stakeholders. So we want IT there, we want ops there, even marketing. So people who have the knowledge around your business rules for each of these systems. And then everyone else that will be using Dexibit can join us a little bit later. So we just want to keep the audience small and focused to start with.
And you mentioned the MBR word in there. Can you talk us through what a business review is?
So a business review is just a time for us to continue to meet once a month. So onboarding, very focused on getting everything set up. A business review is allocated time for us to deep dive into your data together. Often when we start our business reviews, there'll be some carryover from the onboarding process, but we'll still be spending time together configuring your rules and diving into insights on any themes or topics that you're interested in.
And it seems like sort of doing this in 2 weekly sprints or cycles feels like quite a long period of time between each of these working sessions, but there is always a little bit of pre-work, a little bit of homework, right, from each one of those workshops?
Yeah, so after every workshop, there will always be some action items for the customer, whether that's getting clear on what visitation rules are. For some customers, that might be already known and already set. For some others, it might be something that they want to revisit and reset. So just depending on where the customer is at in their journey, yeah, we'll just set some actions for you to really, really define those so that we can make sure we're configuring them accurately in the product.
And so before we do these working sessions, we have a kickoff where we talk about sort of just overviewing the data program for anybody who's new to the conversation. We can at that stage demo the product if anybody hasn't seen it already, or if you've got new people that you've just started with. We can set goals and things for the onboarding itself and then talk through the methods and sort of get into the details of who's coming to what and when and any internal milestones we're planning around and things like that. What's your opinion on who should be at the table in that kickoff? Do you prefer to have a small group of just like the change champions and leaders, or do you like to have everyone and their dog at this session to participate in the conversation? Which one do you think is best?
Definitely a smaller group, so you want exec sponsorship there, definitely. And just key players in operations and IT, the people who have access to these systems, the people who have the knowledge that will help us pull out what we need from these systems that we're connecting, and then also the people who are forming the strategy for your data program, because this kickoff session is where we'll also define your success metrics. So whoever is involved in creating those for the wider team, we definitely want them in that first session.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think when you're involving wider stakeholders in that first kickoff, it can otherwise be quite a long period of time for them in their minds between when they get kickoff and when they do their eventual training, especially if there's any delays in your onboarding process for whatever, or if you maybe choose to stagger your training so that maybe you roll out different user groups at different times. And that can feel like a drag to them if they're waiting. So if you sort of treat their user training as a bit of a kickoff for them, it has a bit more momentum and has a better change impact for those individuals versus the people who you need actually engaged in that onboarding process to get questions and answers out of, to get everything configured up.
Yeah, and we also don't want to get too many cooks in the kitchen too early on, just because, as Angie mentioned, we want to get some answers and have a clear path forward and get things done in a reasonable amount of time. And sometimes we can have a lot of voices in offering their thoughts and ideas, which is really wonderful. These are workshops and they're designed to, have that conversation, but we also want to make sure that it's not too much to sort of get in the way of our onboarding process.
Yeah, that's so true. So maybe we could go through step by step for each of these and sort of talk about what do we need, what are the likely action items going to be, who's going to be involved. So I can start this one off with kickoff because that's sort of often the handover point that we have together. So once we've got all sort of terms cleared and signatured, the big things that I usually suggest to have ready at hand, and this can actually be done as you're sort of finalizing commercials as well, is just start putting together a little bit of a folder of any data that you've got sitting around. Often people have spreadsheets on their desktops and things, and that can be helpful to get off the ground fairly quick. The one big thing that we find really useful is, particularly if you've got some ticketing point of sale systems that might take a little bit of work to get into or whatever the case might be, it's really helpful to have visitation. If you've got daily visitation maybe for the last year or the last few years at hand, or you can get a quick spreadsheet together on that, if it's possible to send that through, especially if you've got the bandwidth to be able to do that quite well in advance of actually kicking off, that can be really cool to get a little proof of concept up and running ready for kickoff so that when we do that demo to stakeholders, it's with your actual data versus with demo data. But otherwise, being able to have that sort of list of internal champions that you're going to involve so we can invite them to meetings, some scheduled time slots is great. And we'll handle the rest in terms of standing up your account and provisioning everything, getting things like the weather sorted and almanacs and things. But having those couple of things on hand is really useful. And as Susan mentioned, involving some of these stakeholders of the key people who are going to lead the data strategy, the actual sort of project effort of getting things connected and being involved in the decision making of things like rules during that onboarding process can be great for that initial kickoff. Susan, take us through that first workshop, that first working session that would happen a couple of weeks after kickoff. So that first other step of that 5-step method, that's a data automation session, right?
Yes, and the data automation session, we will do two things. We'll list out all of the systems that we are going to connect with, and often we will need to define what kind of integration we're going to set up. So that may require us to use some credentials that you have on hand or an introduction to your vendor so that we can work with them to set up that integration. So whoever on your team has that relationship or that knowledge or access to the credentials or the vendors that we're going to work with, very key to have in this data automation workshop. We will also use that time to go over your recognition rules for visitation. We'll record what rules that you have set. How do you define visitation? Is it the number of redeemed tickets on any given day, or is it the number of people that are measured by your footfall cameras? So that's where we'll really get into the details there. If you already have that defined and written down somewhere, definitely a great thing to send through prior to the workshop, but we'll also just use that time to have that conversation so that when we're ready to connect, we can set all of those rules exactly as we've discussed to make sure that those rules are configured.
And if you don't have it written down, don't worry, because we see that very rarely. It's not often that we get a customer who's got their recognition rules documented, let alone even a data audit of what systems they've got. And that's totally cool. Like, we'll dive in there. It doesn't matter if we're finding out some of this stuff along the way. It's just how it is in reality in most places.
Yeah, and a few actions that come off of that meeting is one with us, we will get the initial data loaded, configure those rules, and then the action for you is to check that data. So this is what we call the data integrity checking process, which we outlined for you, and it's just a matter of you looking at the numbers that are based on your visitation rules, and then checking them against your source system and making sure that you have a match. And this can be an iterative process, as it might be something that you're revisiting as a team, how you actually want to define visitation. It's not uncommon for us to see customers choose to change a few things in here and redefine that. So yeah, it may just take a few steps, but the data integrity process is something that we'll do for every system because we want to make sure that everything is accurate and reflecting the numbers that you expect on your end.
And then the next one after that, and we can juggle these around depending on what order they make sense for your own deadlines or your situation. But usually the next one we do is around forecasting and planning, and then, or is it reporting? I should know this. Dashboard and report design. So what we need is inputs for these ones. It's useful to have a copy of any reports that you're currently using. And this could be like a spreadsheet or a PDF or even an email that's being sent around staff, or if you've got an existing dashboard solution, some screenshots or a share of that. It doesn't matter how ugly they are. We've seen it all. So don't be afraid to send them to us. And it doesn't matter if you don't like them or you like them a lot. If you like them a lot and you want us to achieve parity, just send them along and we'll do our best to match. Or you can send us a dashboard and report and say, hey, I hate this for these reasons, and we'll work from there on some improvements. One of the most common things we see is that most existing dashboards and reports or emails or spreadsheets or PDFs are just tables. So one of the first enhancements that we make is usually to throw a few visualizations at them, but people are usually quite attached to tables as well, so we can keep some of those in there as well. But it's getting a reference of what you currently have already is a really important starting point. And some great stakeholders to involve in that discussion are the people who are major consumers of these reports. So it might be some of your leadership who are looking at these sorts of things, or maybe some sysadmins who have been producing these sorts of things. So that's a really great one to have. And a good action out of that one is getting these reports signed off if you do feel like you need an approval process on the design, because one of the really big key items we like to achieve is get some of those reports, even as simple as like a daily visitation report, scheduled and automated to go out to everyone, because it's a great quick win to really starting to help people use data through Dexibit to get that automated so it's landing in the inbox every day or every week or whatever the situation is as part of sort of onboarding with data. What's the next one from there, Susan?
The final onboarding workshop is on goals and forecasting. So ideally, before this workshop, you've shared your goals or your budgets with us. So that would be around visitation, maybe some admission revenue, retail revenue, anything you've got. And that could be one figure for the whole fiscal year or a monthly breakdown. However it is that you want to provide that, we'll upload those so that we can track them against your forecasts. So for this workshop, we will activate forecasting for visitation, and we'll take you through exactly how forecasts work in Dexibit and how to use them for strategic planning.
This is a really interesting conversation when we get to this working session, because there's actually quite a bit of org change involved in this discussion. People who are going from doing forecasting and planning the hard way by either grinding it out and saying, Easter was here this year but the weather was like this and we had this closure here unexpectedly for this reason and next year we're expecting these things. Or they've just been guessing at a high level, or we're sort of just picking a number and putting that down as a target. And so that's actually quite a big leap to make for culture and for process and procedure to get to the point where we're using forecasting. And then, of course, we have the complexity of technology to learn about machine learning and develop trust and confidence in that as well. And so just expect that with this working session, that a lot of that is about that part of the conversation as much as it is about the practicalities of it. What are some of the action items that come out of that one? Are there many?
I think at this stage, by this final onboarding workshop, we will want your visitation rules to be set. So as I mentioned before, through the onboarding process for some customers, it might be something that, is calls for an internal discussion, but forecasts are trained on your visitation rules. So anytime you make changes to them, once they've been configured, the forecasts will need to retrain themselves. And so it might be a little bit of time before they settle and reflect accurately what your forecasted visitation is, because they're based on your rules. So yeah, we definitely at that stage hope that you have those set, and that's why visitation is a real priority during the onboarding process.
And that's often someone like a finance or a sysadmin or someone like that who's doing that data integrity acceptance and getting that authorization to us that, yes, we've got the right numbers, both coming out of the system and being recognized on these core metrics. And then we get into training. What's your preference? Do you like training everyone all at once, or do you like doing it in a staggered fashion?
I usually recommend splitting this user training into 2 separate sessions. So one designed for admin users. These are the people who are going to be in the product the most and who need a little bit more control. So they'll be able to decide what changes they want to make to the data, what transformations, who to invite to the product. And then the second session would be a standard user training session, which you can invite most stakeholders to. So it would be a basic overview of the product. But normally with user training, I wouldn't recommend inviting everyone because everyone's sort of in a different mindset of what they want to use Dexibit for, how they want to use it. So sometimes it's good to just split it into 2, just to give 2 different overviews. And we record the sessions so that they can be used as a resource for the team.
Oh, that's a good idea. I think this is often too where we'll see some deviation between special cases like multi-location portfolios, where often we might attack, say, the head office stakeholder group first, and then we might go sort of region by region or franchise by franchise, depending on how that rollout is planned out for. Or in the case of a new build, often at this point, it might be useful just to do that sysadmin or super user training that Susan mentioned, almost the train the trainer training, and then sort of get into the everybody else quite close to the time, because there's otherwise can be a little bit of a stand down period between sort of being ready or being at that stage of the onboarding process and the actual build of the visitor attraction opening. And if that period of time is too long, then people kind of forget how to do things. So either combining the original training with a refresher or just holding back on that second training block until closer to the time when it can be, more appropriate for them and their preparations for opening can be great. Any sort of other differences that you notice much in multi-location or new build scenarios that can be different?
For multi-locations, we might want to divvy it up by overarching department.
That's a good idea.
You might want to have training for, the retail crowd specifically, or visitor services specifically, or marketing specifically. So we can do that as well.
And some of the other things you might find different for multi-locations, we can sort of have that same phased approach to the whole onboarding. So we don't necessarily have to do all data all at once. We can go, again, region by region, or we can go franchise by franchise, sort of thinking about rolling out incrementally across the organization if you feel that need. And then when it comes to new locations, one of the things that we've got going on there is that a lot of the dependencies of systems being stood up, like a new ticketing system, new point of sale system, new retail partnership, whatever the case, that's all in flux as well. And so what we usually suggest is, first of all, give yourself way more time than you need so that there's plenty of time for discussions to be had for the first time, lots more decisions being made, because it's not just like, how do you recognize visitation? It's more like, how do you want to recognize visitation? And we have to discuss all these things from scratch. But when we get into these systems, it's like often there's not actual data in there, or maybe we're dealing with some sample or test data that we need to flush out. And so just giving yourself more time for these sorts of things to happen and just taking your time through the onboarding process It's a lot more comfortable way of doing things versus rush, getting ready for opening. We have done it. We don't don't like doing it, but it can be done. But ideally, in a perfect world, we can have lots more time up our sleeves for a new build opening to get all of those sorts of things started. Any other things to add into new builds or multi-locations for onboarding?
No, I think that covers it all. I think a big part of it is just trusting the process and taking your time. But yeah, just sticking with us and aligning, because we're here to guide you and help you make those decisions and help you get everything set up the way that you want to. And I know sometimes it can feel really overwhelming when you're just uncovering the answers to a lot of those questions for the first time.
Yeah, that can be really intense for a new team. And definitely, if you're not sure, just let us know, and that way we can sort of come up with some suggestions and answers borrowed from elsewhere. So I know when you do your kickoff, just changing gears here, you often at the end of it ask the customer what their goals for onboarding are. And I love the way that you ask this question because it's usually in quite an open-ended format. And it's always a curiosity for me of what customers say. First of all, because I've got to know them over the course of however long before that, of all of the discussions that we've had that are sort of boiling down to this one point. But also because the answers are so different that everybody gives. How do you encourage a customer to define what onboarding success looks like to them?
Generally, I just want to get down to what's the first thing they expect as soon as they begin the onboarding process, because what I find is that actually there'll be multiple stakeholders on the call and you get a slightly different answer from each of them. By asking that open-ended question, you have everything on the table, and then as a team, you can just prioritize what is the most important objective. This is where we also discover if there are any internal deadlines that we need to align on. That's something we definitely want to work with you on, the customer, as we want to make sure that whatever is on your plate, we're aware of, and we can work dynamically to meet those needs.
Yeah, that's where it's helpful to know we've got beginning of financial year here and we want this report automated ready for that. We've got this board meeting here and we want this answer to this question for that, like getting really precise and specific. Cool. So we're going to get into some lightning round of do's and don'ts for onboarding. Do we want to go one after the other on some of these? I imagine Susan's got a long list of things that she has in mind. I can start us off with one, and that is to actually make some change. If one of the things that quite often comes up for us is people notice that their recognition rules are wrong. It might be how they count visitors, might be how they recognize revenue. And this is what this process is all about, is kind of fleshing out what these rules are and making the change if they're incorrect. And so my first thing would be not to waver, not to dilly-dally. Is this a word outside of New Zealand? I don't know how colloquial this is. But not to muck around when you do find that there are things like this that need changing. It takes a bit of a big breath when this happens, if it does happen to you and you find out you've been counting visitors either too many or too few, or whatever the case might be, the revenue's recognised incorrectly. But be swift with your change, because it can really just hugely slow down the whole process if we can't get clearance and agreement on how many visitors you've got, and the team then start to erode their trust in this number because they know that something's wrong with it, but nobody's sort of talking about the elephant in the room. And it just really sets a tone for how your organizational culture is going to develop around data. And so if this happens to you and you find a problem in your recognition rules, just act fast, make a decision, commit, take the change on head on and move on, rather than sort of failing to make a decision, failing to take action and sort of carrying that with you for months and years afterwards, only to have it still be a problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think in the onboarding process, I think sometimes there's an expectation of, answers to a lot of these questions are yes and no, and it's black and white and business as usual. And that's not always the case. There's always some sort of transformation that comes about, whether that's with visitation or revenue or how you want to analyze the data that you have available to you. So, as you mentioned, I think it's a really good idea to just get in there early, make a call, but also you can lean on us a little bit. This is where we bring in our industry expertise. We can make recommendations based on what we see in other attractions around the world. We can make some suggestions and guide you through that process to make it a little bit easier for you and the team. It doesn't all have to sort of weigh down on one person in the team, or yeah, I think it's something that we can definitely collaborate on together.
What would be one of your do's and don'ts?
I think for onboarding, a lot of customers understandably get really excited and really eager to jump in there and connect everything all at once and want to get everything done within the first few days. And I don't want to say that's not possible, but it's very hard to accomplish all of that seamlessly if we're rushing into it. So my recommendation is just to stay on the path that we have laid out for you. Stick to the sprints, the 2-week sprints. We do give and take there based on what's on your plate, but I think, staying focused will really, the outcome, you'll see a lot more success if we stick to it together rather than kind of going to explore other little side tracks in this process.
Yeah, I would probably add on another one to that of a very similar line is like, don't reinvent the process,
Yeah.
like really trust the process. We've seen what works and we've seen what doesn't. And 9 times out of 10, when somebody wants to do something that's very alternative to our prescriptive methods, it does go south fairly fast. And then we sort of get to the point where we haven't achieved what we wanted to achieve and people get disappointed that we haven't been there. And so we really want to keep everything on track to hit these big things that we know are the big rocks between you and the data change that you want to accomplish. And so by all means, like if you've got specifics that you want to do and you've got some ideas of how you want to customize, do voice those with us. But if we guide you back towards that prescriptive method, I would definitely trust in that. It's there for a reason and it's there from trial and error and cuts and bruises. So we would definitely encourage you to go with it.
And in a similar vein, I think a common mistake is, sometimes customers want to really, really project manage the onboarding process. And while we have this framework, I don't really recommend doing that, setting strict deadlines each day, each week for your team, as that often results in a lot of stress and unnecessary pressure for your team. Because what happens is customers will underestimate how much input or resource they might need, depending on the size and scale of the onboarding project is for them. Say, for example, you have multiple locations and your idea is you want to roll everything out to all locations by the end of it. And so you're setting these timelines and KPIs, and the reality is the data isn't as it's not as tidy and organized coming out of the vendor system as you're expecting and requires a little bit of work, or visitation rules are clear here, not so clear there. So yeah, I think just noting down your needs and requirements, but not really setting firm KPIs and deadlines that your team will eventually burn out trying to meet because the expectations are a little bit high.
Wow, that's such a good point. I think so many organizations, so many visitor attractions go into data programs wanting to be more agile and then try and bring all of these like traditional waterfall project planning processes with them and that journey to agility. It's very difficult when you come at that from a very traditional place of project planning and waterfall kind of rollouts. And when you go into data, it is naturally, especially if you're doing it for the first time, a very messy place. There's a lot of unknowns, and you've got to give yourself and your team the time to run into those and discover as you go. And it's really hard to do that when it's like, on this day, we're going to be doing this task and this deliverable is due on this deadline. I would encourage people, if they feel the need to do some more planning than what we usually are on the side of, is just stick to the approach and talk about who's going to be involved and what the inputs are, and pick out a couple of milestones that you feel you need to deadline for whatever reason and just leave it at that. when we get into like these really big Microsoft project plans of every single activity that's going to have, you're just putting a huge amount of work and administration and overhead into things that are going to be rewritten eventually, because it's just impossible in the data space to have that much foresight to know what problems are going to encounter with what systems, or how long it's going to take someone to do a data integrity check. And putting that amount of pressure on your team just for the sake of having a plan in the first place, we've got to question what the value in that is. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's a fantastic one. Does that mean I have to go with the next one? Oh, goodness. I would say don't just think about onboarding as the IT setup. Capturing knowledge out of the team and using that knowledge to configure that knowledge into a data product so that it's not sitting in people's heads and on people's desktops. It's about shifting culture and getting started with data literacy. It's about getting some quick wins underway. It's about changing some of your policies potentially and your processes or procedures for things like reporting or planning. It's not about just the IT side, so don't just treat it as an IT project.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, sometimes it seems like it might just live the technical people on your team configuring Dexibit, but often they need, the team's input to understand how are they going to configure all the technical bits based on that knowledge that is shared across department to department. So again, it's not just a collaborative effort with the customer and us at Dexibit, but your whole team within your organization and us. One thing that I really encourage is if you are hitting any roadblocks or things are taking longer than expected internally, is to just communicate that to us. We definitely don't want to rush you through the onboarding process. So just giving us a little bit of visibility on what might be going on, what barriers you might be facing, we might help solve for those, and we can also just sort of work dynamically and reshape that onboarding timeframe or structure based on your current needs.
My next one would be celebrating quick wins. I think this is great with any organizational change that you're going through. And there's a great book of what's it called? Something about penguins. My iceberg is melting or something like that by, was it John Cotter? And he talks about quick wins being one of the hallmarks of great change leadership. And I think the value in this is that onboarding takes, a few months. You don't want to wait until the very end before anybody's got any value. Ideally, you get some of that on day one or week one or month one or whatever that looks like for you. And so getting a quick win and being hyper-focused on that is great. Don't let it derail your whole thing and it all becomes about chasing this one thing. But if we can go, oh, look, this is the impact of weather, or, oh, look, we've finally got, a graph of our visitation compound annual growth rate for the last 3 years that we've never had before. Whatever it is, just pick one thing and enjoy it, celebrate the moment with the team, repeat that celebration, really emphasize the win with everyone. That is the kind of momentum that generates change and commitment and buy-in and all of those soft aspects of bringing a team through a change like this. And I think they go a long way.
Yeah, the way some quick wins can be achieved is by uploading your existing data. So we've been talking a lot about connecting data, and by that I mean connecting to live data coming directly from your source system, whether that's ticketing or retail. But I know sometimes it's fun to just get working with some historical data. So we can upload those spreadsheets where you may have that recorded so that you can look at those year-on-year growth rates and you can get it all set up to look at that for the current date. But yeah, that's something that we can do in the interim. We just don't want it to take the core focus off of what we're trying to achieve in the onboarding process, but definitely a solution that we can provide during that process.
And a couple of don'ts, I would say don't wait until it's time to integrate your third-party partners or vendors to give the vendor the heads up. I think it's a really helpful thing as you, on day one, as you get started, just to give them the heads up. Hey, this is coming. We might not be asking for anything yet. We might not be getting going with any integration yet, or whatever that looks like on your plan, but just give them the heads up that it's coming. Sometimes they have their own things that they want to plan for and their own roadmaps or service request queues or whatever that looks like. And it just really is really helpful, I think, gets that partnership off on the right foot if they've got some advance notice on that. So just sending them a quick email, CC us on the introduction if you need to, and just let them know that this is what you're doing. I think sort of expanding that communication. This is turning into more of a do than a don't. Expanding that communication a little bit more broadly than your team when you kick off can be really good. Do you have any don'ts, Susan?
Yeah, I think maybe don't try to compete with the old way of doing things. So you might be transitioning away from some legacy reporting or legacy tools, and they're comfortable and familiar. And so you might have some stakeholders that have a tight grip on those. But I guess, recommend just being open and seeing what we can do and what we could possibly do better for you. So what we don't want to do is be running two systems in parallel. So your legacy reports and then this new reporting tool. We want to make sure that we're having a somewhat seamless transition into the new way.
Such a good one. And what about your hack? Do you have any hacks for onboarding?
Hacks. I think the key thing to onboarding is being open. Yeah, it's not this super rigid, strict project that we're working on together. There's so much that comes out of onboarding and defining these roles and looking at the data that is unexpected, because what we don't know what we don't know, and often we find some really interesting things in your data from the get-go or from your processes that we're discussing. And so if we're open when we're going over all of this, there's really a lot of room for new ideas and new ways of working that can really benefit you. So that's I don't know if that's a hack.
Growth mindset.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I think your last one as well. That's usually my hack. I suggest to people upload it.
Yeah.
And it gives you that quick win and it helps get you to value, get you to insight faster. And sometimes you get there and find an upload is all you need. And then you avoid having to go through integration, which is always a good one when you can. And I remember before we started recording, Susan and I were chatting about onboarding and our experiences over the while. And you mentioned some good ones about this good philosophy between onboarding and implementation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so onboarding is really just the period in which you're being exposed to the product, getting familiar with the product. And the way that we define the completion of onboarding is when we've successfully achieved that. So all of the key stakeholders have been introduced to Dexibit. We are focusing on integrating your core systems and configuring, things for your core needs. And then we'll transition into implementation. So implementation is really a carryover from onboarding. It's where we're really establishing everything. And I think just the difference is that onboarding is like that first intro to Dexibit, how we're going to get this going. It's an introduction to the structure of how we're going to get everything set up. And then implementation is when we get absolutely everything set up and then rolling so that it's usable for all stakeholders.
Yeah, that's such an amazing way of looking at it. I think it also gives you that comfort. Like some people, when we transition from onboarding into the business reviews, there's that feeling of everything has to be perfect and complete, and it might not be. And it might be that, I don't know, you're changing out this system over here and so we haven't integrated it yet, or we've still got these questions around this data integrity on this point here, or so-and-so hasn't given over the credentials, so we haven't begun this thing yet. The idea is not necessarily that everything is done imperfect, because it may never be if you're changing out systems or going through other kind of procedural or policy changes, that there'll always be some stuff that's in flux. Onboarding is about the special equation of things that we've found leads to success with data change. Have we ticked those boxes? Have we got our governance in place that we understand how data should be transformed and recognized? Have we got some basic design so that people can get into the product and look at some stuff? Be more to come. Have we got some forecasts stood up and a plan uploaded if you use one already? Have we talked about what that change looks like between the two? And have we introduced our stakeholders to some training? It's those core ingredients. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single loose end is chased down and tied off. And there will always be sort of a roadmap of carry that you have in the data space. Data is never done. You always sort of have this ongoing bits and pieces that you're doing here and there as you're going through changes yourselves and different systems or restructures or admission policy changes or whatever the case might be. Well, Susan, I think that's a pretty good list. If you want some more details on the Dexibit onboarding method, you can head over to our website where Susan's written some great materials to prompt everybody in on what to expect from the onboarding process. So dive in, and thanks for sharing your knowledge with us today, Susan.
Thanks, Angie.
If your goal is to get more visitors through the door, engaging and spending more, leaving happy and loyally returning, check out Dexibit's data analytics and AI software at Dexibit.com. We work with visitor attractions, cultural and commercial, integrating with over 100 industry source systems across visitor experience and venue operations, providing dashboards, reports, insights, forecasts, data management, and a unique data concierge. Until next time, this is Dexibit.